sometimes when we talk, we don't know what the so we have to call and ask a friend. I wanna know the things you know. It'll make a better show. You're the one on whom we all depend.
Hey everyone, welcome to UNFTR's Phone a Friend. Today is a real treat. We all get to live tuition-free inside the head of one of the most prominent intellectuals on the left, Ben Burgis. Ben is a Jacobin columnist, an adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers University, and the host of the YouTube show and podcast, Give Them an Argument, a personal favorite of mine. He's also the author of several books, including Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, and Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why It Matters. Now, I've long admired Ben's writing and his ability to engage in high-level political discussions without devolving into shouting matches. He's a wealth of knowledge, always brings receipts, and he maintains an inspiring level of optimism and curiosity as one of the most prominent, multidisciplinary scholars in media. Today, we discuss economic systems, what's happened to the left movement in the United States to the extent that there is one, expressions and tendencies of socialist theory throughout history, and the déjà vu lesser of two evils choice that confronts the electorate. We even get Ben to drop an FMF reference, so you know that I can die happy. I hope you enjoy our discussion today, and remember to like and subscribe to the channel and comment below if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening to the pod, remember to leave us a positive review. Visit UNFTR.com to learn more about our new membership tiers, to access our directory of progressive resources, sign up for our weekly newsletter, and to read our essays or original articles from our partners at Newsbeat. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Ben Burgis. All right, well, Ben Burgis, welcome to the show. I was able to kind of get all my fan stuff out of the way because I know that can be annoying for people before we jumped on. But I really did want to say thank you for coming on to UNFTR. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So I figured we start in the present day, and then I was going to kind of take a tuition-free ride through your head, to take advantage of the fact that you're here to go through some socialist theory and kind of bring our listeners up to speed on some of the concepts that we had gone over in a multi-part series over the summertime to see if we can kind of bridge the gap. But you had a discussion recently that has been happening all over the left that we've gotten a ton of feedback on at UNFTR, which is kind of the state of the Democratic Party in the context of what's happening with the progressive movement, if you can call it that, the fracture that has obviously splintered over the genocide in Gaza, and a number of other externalities that I think are causing sort of a crisis on the so-called left right now. But you and Nathan and a few others have been kind of going through, at least talking through what comprises the left and where some intersectionality might be to kind of assuage this idea of the lesser of two evils come the election time. And I'm just curious, like, how are you interpreting this moment in time for the left writ large as it faces sort of this crisis with the election coming up?
Yeah, so I had that conversation with Nathan, and then I think maybe even the next day or like a couple days later, I had an article in Jacobin that was about this. It's called like Joe Biden is assisting genocide in Gaza and imperiling his reelection or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I think that I guess there are a couple of issues here, but I want to start with the one that's kind of most front of mind probably for most people. So, which is the sort of immediate subject to the conversation with Nathan, which was kind of reflecting on, lesser evil arguments that, we've both maybe made in the past and, and whether this changes those and how. And, I thought he'd be an interesting person to talk about that with, because I know he's had very like well-defined views on this stuff in the past. And, my own view is that there is a rational case that's like pretty straightforward that if you live in one of the tiny handful of states where your vote actually might matter, then it is a preferable outcome, right? To have a awful centrist Democrat than a Republican who's going to fill the National Labor Relations Board with hardcore union busters and do all of the other things that that we know he's going to do. And I think that you can see both of these people as enemies, but still understand they're different kinds of enemies, and that it might make a tactical or strategic difference to you which enemy you're fighting against, right? I mean, if you sort of imagine some scenario in a horror movie where the villain has like set up two rooms where there are horrible things that are going to happen that are going to try to kill you, and you get to choose, right? Like, you don't say, oh, I refuse on principle to choose between these rooms. You try to figure out which one you and your friends have a better chance of surviving, and you pick that one, right? That's always been my view on this. I put it in almost those terms in 2020. I will say I don't think anything has changed about the sort of rational core of that argument, but I have lost a lot of my appetite for making it this year for obvious reasons. Yeah. Like especially I think about my home state of Michigan, where there's, they have, Biden's reelection chances are in serious trouble. It's one of the states that Trump won in 2016 and then that Biden won in 2020. And it's, it's a serious issue that, has the largest Arab American population of any state. And, look, I'm not going to shake my finger at somebody who can't bring themselves to pull that lever, because there is an actual, no kidding genocide. I mean, if the word genocide, seems like a bridge too far for anything that doesn't involve gas chambers, then, call it a sparkling ethnic cleansing. But, there is this just deep human horror that's going on that, that Biden is facilitating in all sorts of ways. And, and I think it's the most understandable thing in the world that a lot of people who, are more closely identified with the victims of that, who in some cases might actually have members of their extended families, who are victims of that, cannot possibly bring themselves to vote for this guy. And, if I still lived in Michigan, could I, between now and November, like kind of psych myself up to the point that I was capable of pulling the lever and then going home and throwing up? Maybe. Right. Happily, I don't have that problem. I live in California where it does not matter whatsoever. Right. If Brother West is on the ballot, I'll probably vote for him. Otherwise, I really hope we're not in a place in November where ceasefire is still a relevant thing to write in, but I have a horrible feeling that it might be. That I actually just got my mail-in ballot. That's probably what I'm going to do on the presidential line. Probably a clearer statement than voting for Marianne or Dean Phillips. So I think that on the one hand, I might still make that calculation, but I completely understand. I mean, if you just psychologically can't, right? That's the most reasonable thing in the world. And, I think that, I've always had a problem with like over moralizing the choices that people make when they're in the ballot box and they're confronted with like the bad choices that our ridiculous half democratic system leaves them at the end, right? Whether that's sort of moralizing in the direction of shaking your finger at third party voters, or it's moralizing in the direction of, saying, oh, you voted for Biden, so you're responsible for everything, that it always kind of misses the point to me. And I think in this case in particular, the main person whose fault it is that Trump might win because Biden is doing this is Biden. And I really think it's a mistake to lose focus on that.
Let's see if I can sort of artfully bridge the gap between past and present then, because you, in that discussion with Nathan, you played a clip from Krystal and Sagar's show where Krystal had kind of reconsidered her position from the, I think now infamous debate with Briahna Joy Gray, where they were, which I think was actually a really helpful debate. I actually found a lot of value in that because I think it was a pretty elevated. I didn't love the way Kyle was presenting some of the issues, but I did appreciate the sentiment that was coming from what most outsiders would view as leftists that are aligned on nearly everything. The case that I was making at the time was it's almost as though that
last time I saw all three of those people was at the first two's wedding. So like, right. These aren't people who you think of as mortal enemies.
Right. Yeah. And I think it was a respectful but spirited discussion that teased out something that was interesting for me to see, which was it's almost as though during that moment in time, Krystal and Kyle couldn't hear the complete lack of hope that Briahna was projecting from a segment of the population that is underrepresented in that she was sort of expressing what some people might term accelerationist theory, but saying, at what point do we draw that line and say we need a do-over? And so the bridge that I wanted to put to you actually goes back to a discussion that you had. One of my favorite discussions that you've ever had was with David Friedman. And you should know that hashtag FMF, fuck Milton Friedman, is actually the slogan of our show. It's a socioeconomic show. But I found the debate actually really, really fascinating.
Yeah, David, for anybody who doesn't know, it would be Milton's son.
Yeah. And we could maybe talk about that another time because I am so utterly fascinated by that discussion. But one of the things that you were talking about is sort of this. When do we clear the pieces off the chessboard? When do we actually start to reconsider the systems and the structures in the way that maybe a Michael Albert or an Esther Duflo might be thinking about, or a Thomas Piketty? Those people aren't really being seriously considered, I think, in any sort of elevated global discussions right now. But there are certainly people that are doing that work to think about what another system might be like. So when you listen to somebody like Briahna, who's representing that sort of cultural boots on the ground aspect of nothing material had changed between Biden and Trump, so why would you insist that I am better off one way or the other, or that people I'm speaking for are? At what point do we try to clear the pieces off the table? Like what will be that breaking point that allows us to reconsider structures holistically from our political apparatus, but also to the economic framework that I think you're striving for, and that I'm learning a great deal about, but obviously want to unpack more.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think to start with the electoral stuff, I mean, I guess one thing that, when I started the previous answer by saying there are a couple of different issues here, I only ended up really speaking to one of them because, which is about sort of what do you do about the election and whose fault is that? But another is that the way you'd framed the first question was about the left, and the sort of larger structural problem is that we sort of don't have one of those right now. We have left media, and there are certainly activists and organizers who exist and do good work, but it's it's not a power block in American society to any significant extent, right? Like that there are out of the 435 members of the House of Representatives, there are, a handful who are sort of social democrats, although they also kind of, just structurally, given the position that they're in, they end up having a kind of ambiguous relationship to, the centrist leadership of the Democratic Party and not being as oppositional all the time as people would necessarily like them to be. Which is, again, a sign of that larger, structural weakness that, like I remember when people were arguing about kicking Jamal Bowman out of DSA. I think I'm remembering this right, for the Iron Dome vote. And, this is probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but I always thought that his, if that had actually happened, his response probably would have been, wait, I was kicked out of what? Did I join that? you know,
That's fair.
because it's just not the sort of threat of DSA not supporting somebody, and that's like the largest socialist organization that's existed in generations in the U.S. is just really not something that's going to keep a politician up at night, right? Like it just doesn't represent a significant power block in our society. And the reason I really want to like stress that is not to be doom and gloom about it. I mean, I think that, I think you have to, try your hardest to build something and, and to sort of build on whatever little you have, but just to emphasize that, the problem from my perspective is that there's nothing, it's not a sort of choice like, oh, do we do revolution or not? Right. That like, that we're just not in a position, right, where we can do that. I mean, there's nothing that the left, to the extent that such a thing even exists in America right now, there's nothing that we can do that's going to result in like the two-party system not existing, right? And that's never mind capitalism not existing, right? I mean, that would be the final boss, right? The two-party system is like a pretty entry-level boss, right? By comparison to that, right? So in the debate with David Friedman, which is a very very strange experience. We'll talk about another time, but in that debate, what we were talking about was really like the normative issue, right? So, in other words, look, if we could get rid of capitalism, should we? Or, to be optimistic about it, when we can, right? Should we? Right. And of course, I'm an enthusiastic yes to that, and also obviously, I mean, yes to get rid of the two-party system too, right? But that's that's surely that's like a pretty distant necessary condition, right? Along with many others, right, to get to the point where you could actually overcome global capital. But yeah, I mean, look, if the sort of road from where we are now, which is that we have about 6.5%, or maybe even a little bit less at this point, private sector unionization, to overthrowing capitalism and instituting workers' control of the means of production, is a depressingly long one. And I don't think I have any amazing insight to offer, about how to, get all the way from here to there. I mean, I think one thing, the last few years have definitely shown is that things I didn't expect to happen pretty constantly happen, which, you can, usually bad things in the last few years, but there's an optimistic side of that too, right? That like what seems possible now might not be what seems possible in 10 years. But yeah, on the normative question, absolutely. I mean, this is, I mean, the sort of system that, Milton and Rose Friedman and their son now are celebrating, right, is awful. I mean, like, it's not, you have people who work in Amazon warehouses, peeing in bottles because they're afraid they won't make quota. And, their boss owns his own spaceship, and that's even outside of the most extreme examples, that can be curbed to a certain extent by strong unions and a big welfare state and all of that stuff. There's both the sort of strategic concern, which is as long as you leave the capitalists, the people who actually own the economically productive assets of society, with their economic power, they'll always find ways to translate that to political power and take away those gains you've already won. And then there's the normative issue, which is just, it's fundamentally unreasonable that some people have to spend all day, taking orders from people who aren't democratically accountable to them because they don't have money, and other people can spend all day giving orders because they do. And that's long term. That's not something we should just have to live with.
So when we think about today versus, let's say, a decade ago, it felt like, so I remember reporting early on the Occupy movement because I'm New York based, and I think I started reporting on it about day 3 in the park, and I was And I just kept going back. I was mesmerized by the democratization of the decision making. Mostly, that was what I found really fascinating until things sort of fell apart within a couple of months. But for that brief moment in time, I remember thinking, this is interesting because this is different. This isn't something I've experienced before, and I wondered how widespread it could be. And it was at that time I feel like the intersection of the Bernie movement and the popularization of the concept of the 99% and all of these things sort of coalesced to give a heartbeat to what I think people today, at least looking backwards, might consider the beginning stages of a movement or a movement in a moment in time. And it felt like we were so ascendant for a little while, post-Occupy, coming out of the financial crisis and maybe the lackluster response of the Obama administration. And then the shock therapy that was the fascist turn of Trump. And I think people just being so sidelined and distracted by that it took the movement more off path than I think we even realized at the time. So, okay, how come the Trump administration wasn't the impetus to put that back on the rails? Was it really just the DNC circling the proverbial wagons to prevent the Bernie movement and to sort of kill it in the crib there? Or, I mean, you know, what was that moment in your mind now that you have a few years to kind of look back on it to say that, okay, this is when the wind really came out of what we would consider the movement?
Yeah, I guess I don't know that it was necessarily because I actually think the wind really came out a few years later than Trump coming in. Like, I mean, if anything, from my perspective, it was, you know, windiest around like, you know, 2017, right? That's that, you know, that's the time that I was feeling the most powerful gusts, certainly. So, you know, like Occupy, you know, I think had a million problems that, you know, you kind of gestured at a little bit in the way you set it up. But, you know, the thing that was, you know, most significant about it is that, you know, even though, you know, a very small number of people really like when you think back to it and add it all up, were actually participating, and especially in those sort of, you know, ultra democratic meetings and all that. I mean, like, you know, you need a lot of time, right? Like this is, there's a reason that the Athenians had slaves to free up citizens to spend all day in the assembly. But even so, I think what was significant about it was just that it was like a high profile thing that captured a lot of public consciousness, that had these slogans about the 99% and the 1%, and that really sort of put, class, in however incoherent a way, on people's radar and as, like, you know, in the center of discussion in the United States, in a way that it just hadn't been in living memory, and definitely the first Bernie campaign, you know, picked up on that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the first Bernie campaign, I mean, in a sense, was the closest, you know, that anything, you know, like to actually, you know, I mean, he won 22 states. That's remarkable. But I will say that, you know, when you're thinking about the movement, which I think we do need to make a distinction here between the movement and like the public at large, because I think they had very different reactions to Trump coming to office. But, you know, when you're thinking about the sort of Bernie-ish movement, that actually picked up steam after Trump was elected. I mean, like I can just say, you know, from my particular anecdotal data point, you know, that, you know, I was living in central New Jersey at that point. I was very involved in central New Jersey DSA back then. And I went through, you know, most of 2016, I was, you know, going to a lot of meetings where it's the same six people looking at each other around the table. And then in like December 2016, it was the, cat. It was like 50 people, right? 60 people, you know, like crowded in like the basement of a union hall. And I think that's actually pretty typical from what I could tell. I think that there is like a segment of people who the conclusion they drew from the whole experience in 2016 was, like liberalism, like mainstream liberalism showed that it couldn't defeat that it couldn't defeat, right populism. So what we need is some kind of left populism to defeat it. And like, look, Bernie came so close, right? There's proof of concept there. And
Right.
so you did have like people flooding into DSA, for example, and you did have 2 years into the Trump administration. You had those first few squad members being elected to Congress. And there was actually a lot of wind at the back of the second Bernie run, originally, right?
Sure.
He won all three of the first three states, right?
Mhm.
Like in Nevada, especially, right? Like he actually got an outright, majority in a crowded field and had a very like multiracial, voting base. Got to see a little bit. I mean, I spent a day just before the primary, like canvassing cab drivers at the Vegas Strip to support him. But I think what we really saw, I think, is that, yeah, look, there's a certain segment of people who drew the conclusions I was just talking about from the experience of 2016, but it's not what most Americans drew from 2016, right? Like most people who are like broadly, liberal, I think drew the conclusion, oh no, this is a catastrophe. Especially when COVID, especially the combination of COVID and what they perceived as like awful mismanagement of COVID by Trump and the George Floyd protests and riots. And it's like, okay, everybody's sick. Everything is on fire. We just need to get back to normal. Right. And I think that longing to get back to normal, more than anything, like, look, I mean, people in except for South Carolina, where there's like an unusually conservative Democratic electorate, which is why they're going first now. Other than that, all the states that Biden won when it was still a competitive race, the exit polls, Democratic voters said they supported Medicare for all, right? And
Of course, right.
Bernie is
Right.
Mr. Medicare for all, and Biden, said he'd veto it at one point. And certainly is the only centrist who wasn't making any effort to have it both ways or do some sort of like 9-dimensional, like, oh, I'm going to do Medicare for all who want it or anything like that. He was just, frankly not in favor of it. So the question is why? And I think that it's like, yeah, most normie Dem voters, sure, like they like the idea of Medicare for all. I don't think they take it very seriously. Like they don't think it's going to happen, but like they'd want it, right? They'd be in favor of it if they did think it was going to happen. But they weren't voting based on that because like that sounds like that sounds like a fantasy. Like their whole experience of politics is that politicians promise that they're going to do good things. They just don't. It just never seems to happen. I think there is this like really bone deep kind of capitalist realism there. So what are people voting on? They're voting on who do they think is going to be a better candidate to take out Trump? And, which, of course we all thought was Bernie, but, I think that, I think that wasn't the main, that wasn't the perception that most people had.
Right.
And so, I think that was incredibly demoralizing, the loss of that second Bernie campaign. And I think demoralizing to an extent that's become more obvious over the last few years. Cause, at the time, I have to say, I was sort of, okay, this is a setback. That's awful. Right. But like, that's, things are still so much better than they used to be, right? Like there's such a more significant left presence than there used to be, right? Let's see what happens in a couple of years. And I think looking back on it, that was, that was a little, I don't know. I mean, I feel a little bit like one of those Japanese soldiers who was like, still in a cave in the South Pacific in, the 1960s, that like, not realizing that the war was over, right? That like, that doesn't mean that like, left politics is over. It just means that like the sort of particular opening that we saw there, right? I think, I think there was a very severe defeat that happened in 2020. And like, I guess my last thought about this is just that part of why it was such a defeat and part of why it was so demoralizing is that like those Bernie campaigns had a kind of gravitational force to them that anybody who had leftish views, who had any kind of instinct for like participating in real world politics, and not just, criticizing for the sidelines, was like really drawn to that. And so like a lot of people were, I don't know, you think about like, Adolph Reed and Cornel West, used to hate each other, and they kind of came together, over that, right? Like that's everybody involved in that, Chris, Krystal, Kyle, and Bree conversation you were saying, right? They were all together over that, right? That and lots of people who maybe who were maybe on the sort of you should vote lesser evil, side of some of the tactical issues we were talking about earlier. Lots of people who'd like always voted for the Green Party, we're together over that because it just had this gravitational force that pulled in everybody. And since then, there really hasn't been anything that's had that effect, right? There hasn't been anything that's been like, oh, this is, there's certainly been things that have happened that leftists have cared a lot about, right? But there hasn't been anything that's like, oh, this is the thing that's going to sort of overwhelmingly draw in people to like, this is the project, right? To focus on, and certainly not like something that where the left, such as it is on the offensive, right? Like it was with the Bernie campaign. I mean, you can get a zillion people to go into the street, quite rightly to protest the atrocities in Gaza, but like the idea of like, oh, here's like a project that we're all doing together to like actually try to move the needle forward and not just like object to whatever the most recent horrific things that have happened. There really hasn't been anything like that.
So let's talk about how movements do coalesce outside of responding to events and tragedies. And in the series that we did over the summer, and this is where I'm very grateful that I can just ask the person that I was probably reading at the time. One of the things that occurred to me was I didn't really understand the fracture among working class movements throughout history. So even going back to, I would guess, the splinter of craft and trade unions in Western economies in Europe in the 1800s, through to the socialist movement with and I guess the splinter between like Gompers and Debs. And this seems to be a very repetitive through history, is that in periods of decline, when it makes the most sense for the so-called working class, and I'm not really sure that I have a proper understanding or identity of what that even means anymore.
Okay,
but the working class as a concept coming together during these depressive periods to fight back against capitalist and corporate interests, and yet there still seems to be a fundamental difference in worldview between the Bakunin Proudhon sort of wing of things versus the Marxian view that we're going to have to use and align with the labor movement, with the union movement rather, in order to be able to effectively take over the system from within, if we're ultimately going to have the transition between capitalism and socialism. So it seems to me that fundamental fracture has actually never been healed, that's something that's been persistent in socialist and democratic socialist movements throughout history, where there's never been full alignment with labor. And yet the concept that we always seem to return to whenever we're thinking about, okay, we need to reestablish what the left means and progressive values, will be and begin and end with the working class, so to speak. But the working class is itself not a monolith. So how do we reconcile that from a historical perspective? Have you ever seen examples through history where certain cultures got it right?
Right. So I think I heard a few things in there. One of them was about, like what we even mean maybe when we're talking about the working class. I think,
Sure.
I mean, I think my, sort of boring answer to that would be that the, working class is the set of people who are, who, don't own means of production sufficient to make a living off of that, and thus have to rent out their working hours to a capitalist, right? That's the that's what the working class is. I think maybe the wrinkle that might get closer to what you're actually asking about is that what I've just defined is what Marx would call the working class is a class in itself, but then the sort of trick is, well, how to make that a class for itself. In other words, how to because look, you could be a member of the working class as I've just defined it, which by the way doesn't you don't have to have a particular kind of job or work in manufacturing or whatever to fit that definition. I mean, anybody who's dependent on wage labor to make their living and doesn't run the place, can't hire and fire their people, right? Is going to fall within that. But I would, but like, of course you could be a member of the working class in that sense, without seeing yourself as a member of the working class,
sure,
or certainly acting politically or even at the workplace in ways that reflect, that you see yourself that way, right? I mean, there are, there are like, you drive several hours north of here and you'll find an ocean of people who have like, IT sector, wage labor, who are like, I don't know, a lot of them are libertarians. They're sort of, they
still,
they hate the idea of unions, there's not, I mean, I don't know, maybe fewer, but I mean, I'll bet you could still find a bunch, right? So, so yeah. And I mean, that's incredibly hard, right? Like how to get people to, identify that way and kind of act on that basis, right? But I mean that's kind of the whole problem, right, of socialist politics, because if everybody, I mean, this is like one way of seeing this in Marxist terms is that like, all right, so two famous one-liners from Marx. One of them is that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class. In other words, that nobody can do it for the working class; it has to do it for itself. The other is that the ruling ideas of every era are the ideas of the ruling class, and and those jangle against each other in an uncomfortable way, right? Like, and that's therein kind of lies the problem. And how do you sort of convince workers to sort of see themselves in that light and act in that light, and the obstacles to that, I should say, aren't, I don't want to portray it as if it's just sort of ideological, right? That people were tricked. That there's also structural obstacles to that. I just wasn't planning on this, but since the book is right next to me as I'm talking, right? There's the Class Matrix by Vivek Chibber. If you read that, right, he goes into this in depth, right? There are lots of rational reasons why people don't sort of seek out collective organization. That it's just it's risky on an individual level, right? You're often better off, pursuing more individualistic strategies for making the best of things.
Well, I think that was the big lesson from the Clinton era, which I would consider to be sort of the peak of the neoliberal era, where they tried to actually exercise a lot of the philosophical elements of what we would consider neoliberalism in policy practice, and in the alignment of the New Democrats with what the Contract for America was trying to accomplish. And I think what the New Democrats discovered was that not everybody is either hardwired or even wants to be an entrepreneur. That most people are looking for fairness. They're looking for stability. They're looking for, the highest probable outcome for the work that they're doing, and then that security and safety net that they are going to have health care, that they're not going to be one paycheck away from being decimated. That, to me, was the big lesson out of the Clinton years, where they tried to impose that new Democrat philosophy, which was really just neoliberalism in disguise.
Yeah. So I think that, maybe not much of a disguise at that point. I think the disguise got, I think there was a sort of unabashed neoliberalism there that it's like now, we can question how much the content has really changed, right? But I think the Democratic messaging is at least more ambiguous now. I think maybe because, some of what you're talking about, that a lot of that stuff got very unpopular. But yeah, look, people do want security. There are lots of people who, lots of people do want to be entrepreneurs. Most of them can't, but lots of people don't, right? And so there are definitely openings there for collective action, but it is really, a serious problem, right? That you need to, you need to show people that they're going to get something out of it, sort of proof of concept, that, certainly with the labor movement, we've just had this big upsurge in strike activity, but also actual union density, I think, as Nathan pointed out in that conversation, right?
Declined.
Has actually declined even more.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff is, it's sort of it's maybe declined so much that it helps explain why, there's this sort of turn towards a little bit more militancy now. But
it's also humbling when you look at the year-end, the annual reports from all of the big automakers and the profits that they stacked up in excess of what they did the year before. And even as they write in their annual reports, in spite of union actions, we crushed it, is basically what they were saying. So it's sort of like, oh, okay.
Yeah. It was enough that they did get a lot, from the stand-up strike, but still, totally. Yeah. Right. So, that's a serious problem. And it's like, again, it's one that I don't want to pretend to have some like great magical solution to, right? Like, I think that it's, I think that I think that on both fronts, on the workplace and, and in political action, right, that you have similar problems with sort of the fact that, it's very hard to reverse that kind of spiral of decline and demoralization, right? You need to get some wins. You need to have, it's very hard to overcome this sort of, like a lot of well-earned distrust of the idea that things are going to get any better, through collective action, that a lot of people have, and that's kind of the problem right now. But I guess I would just say my big note of caution, because in your initial question you brought up all this stuff about Proudhon and Bakunin and all of that, and I would just say that I think there's this persistent temptation, both from people who, most from people who actually explicitly understand themselves to be in this tradition, but also for people who maybe don't have that understanding exactly, but are just kind of trying to figure stuff out in the moment and don't necessarily know a lot about the history of past attempts, who think that, oh, well, look, trying to take over the existing economic and political machine isn't going well. So I know what we'll do, right? We'll secede and form our own thing, right?
Yeah.
And, that this is like the way that people who are, again, either conscious anarchists or sort of, unconsciously replicating some of this stuff will sort of use the phrase dual power, which meant something specific in Russia in 1917. That has really nothing to do with what they're talking about. But like what they mean is like building up alternative institutions outside of the existing society. that they hope will sort of one day become in competition with those that we'll build our own. We're not going to try to sort of build up working class power within existing workplaces. We're going to build up our own, co-ops and communes, and we'll build our own little electricity grid and all this stuff. And I would just say,
but if we take Proudhon without the secessionist attitude and think about the rise of worker co-ops and the efficacy of worker co-ops, the one thing that I felt when I was reading Proudhon that he understood about the burgeoning capitalist system was that had to also be paired with the right regulatory environment and a strong central bank that could help facilitate that. And I think that actually kind of gets into what modern movements might look like, and even the debate that you were having with Friedman about the structural impediments that we put in place to prevent even those type of experiments from really taking off to achieve the levels of let's say a Mondragon. But can you speak to some of those structural impediments here? Because I think Friedman felt in his discussion with you that he was sort of finding some momentum, though missing the plot, that if co-ops are all that, they would be everywhere here, and there's your evidence that it doesn't work. So, but not listening to the arguments about the structural barriers, can you sort of illuminate that as we talk about movements that might be among the working class that have been proven to be successful in other mature economies?
Sure. So I would say that, it's like, and I guess maybe tying together both this and what we're talking about with the previous question, that, that you're just not like, look, any questions about, like, what are the things that frustrates me the most when leftists start talking about strategy is that so many of them don't do it comparatively, right? They're trying to have an argument about whether to pursue strategy A or strategy B, and their argument will proceed. Strategy A has all these problems and it hasn't been working, therefore let's do strategy B. And it often misses. Well, hold on. Are the obstacles faced by strategy B actually less than the obstacles faced by strategy A? Or are they more, right? I mean, we have to figure that out to even make this, this argument make sense. And yeah, I mean, I think those kinds of secessionist attempts have been continuously tried for about as long as capitalism has existed, maybe even a little bit before, depending on how exactly you demarcate it, right? Go back to like the diggers in the English Revolution in the 1600s. And
I was going to say New Harmony, but okay. Wow.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, way before New Harmony, right? and it's not. I mean, actually, like, and you face all sorts of obstacles that like for one thing, that the state doesn't go away just because you choose to ignore it, right? I mean, that would be figures. But then also more relevantly, we start thinking about things like New Harmony, or even just sort of day-to-day attempts at building worker co-ops right now, just structural features of a capitalist economy. So one thing that's very striking is that, look, the idea of workers, pooling together resources and, and like starting a cooperative factory or something is not, unusual, right? It's not like, if it's not like this was like first suggested in like a Richard Wolff lecture on YouTube, that this is like you read like Marx's inaugural address to the First International, and he's talking about cooperative factory attempts. And by the way, in that address, he's not, he's not poo-pooing it, right? Like he actually says there's great value in this because because it proves that it's possible, right? Mm-hmm. to run, to run a factory efficiently without it being, without bosses, essentially, right? That's his point. And there's great value in that, right? But the one thing he, I think, rightly doesn't think is that, oh, well, we just need to build up those efforts and eventually, right, we'll sort of outcompete the capitalists, and then we'll have socialism, emerging from within the rules of the free market. And why not? Okay, so I think there are a bunch of reasons why not, and one of those is that is one of the biggest ones that goes back to your point about Proudhon and I think it's a little bit unclear in Proudhon's case when he talks about bank, whether, like some sort of people's bank, right? Like who he's actually imagining sponsoring this, but the core of the idea, right? Like why banking is really important, right? In thinking about, transition to socialism is that, if you think about financing mechanisms for cooperatives, right? Like you can have like one thing that you sort of almost definitionally can't do, right? Is finance it by selling stock ownership, because if you're rewarding investors with ongoing ownership shares, right, then to the extent that you've done that, you are to that extent no longer a cooperative, right? So so that's like a huge financing mechanism that you've lost right off the bat. There are also structural advantages, where that traditional firms have over cooperative firms in terms of expansion. It's way easier, actually existing co-ops. They don't actually, from the evidence that we have, it's understudied, but like for the evidence that we have, they don't seem to like go out of business at a higher rate, than other kinds of firms, but they do seem to expand more slowly, which makes a lot of sense. Sure. Because if you have a traditional firm where the workers don't get a vote in the decision making, then it's very easy to prioritize expansion over compensation for people who are already working for you. That's pretty straightforward why that would be the case, right? And why it would be.
Yeah, and I think people conflate that with the slow expansion with also the lack of innovation, which would be vital for certainly a capitalist economic system. But I don't think that those two are the same thing.
No, definitely. And whatever. I mean, innovation is vital to, any thriving economic system, but no, I don't think those are the same thing, right? I think that like coming up with new stuff and like opening, new locations, are just different things, straightforwardly. And, if we really want to talk about innovation, I think it's also important to recognize, that, like certainly, okay, we do want to make a distinction between like inventing new technology and sort of seeing the applications of that technology to like filling consumer needs, right? Those are two different things. But on the first one, at least, it is truly remarkable, right? How much of that happens within the public sector, right?
Sure.
That like actually really, when you get right down to it, it's kind of remarkable how little the private sector is actually doing of that, right? So there's a book by a woman with a Italian name that I cannot remember right now. I feel bad. Called The Entrepreneurial State, where she talks about this, and if you see her give like talks about it, it's like the only TED talk that I'd recommend people watch is hers about this. She does this thing where she talks about the iPhone, and this is take everything in this phone, right? That like actually makes it a smartphone and not a dumb phone. The internet itself, global positioning system, the touch screen technology. Every single one of these things was developed by people working in the public sector, often in the Defense Department. But I mean, like, I don't think there's anything magical about that we need to have it be linked to killing people in order in order to do it, right?
Hey, Ben, are you suggesting that centralized planning can actually elicit innovative concepts?
Yeah, I think that the evidence is pretty clear on that, right? They have that's I mean, anybody watched I mean, God, to stick with military industrial complex examples, right? Anybody who watched Oppenheimer last year will notice that they weren't working in the Manhattan startup. That was that was the public sector. So in fact, I actually think that's one of the things that there are things that we don't really know how to do with centralized planning, but that is actually something that we do know how to do with centralized planning. Centralized planning is pretty good at that. And then to the extent that you do need like you take the things that centralized planning isn't very good at, which are lining up production with fine-grained consumer preferences, right? So like Bhaskar Sankara's book, The Socialist Manifesto, in the first chapter of that, which even if you don't read the whole book, I'd recommend people read that first chapter. It's called A Day in the Life of a Socialist Citizen, and it sort of tries to vividly imagine, right, what a better society would look like. And in the course of that discussion, he says, I don't think this line's original to him, but I don't remember who he's quoting. But he has this line about how the Soviet economy, the problem with like Soviet economic planning, or one of them, right, was that it was all thumbs and no fingers, right? That it was, by which he means it was like very good at churning out just immense numbers of tractors and tanks to, thank God for it, or, Hitler might have won the war. But it was very bad at like, coordinating what was in the shelves in the grocery stores with what Soviet citizens actually wanted, which, there's a way that you can kind of roll your eyes at that and sort of, do like radical posturing. It's like, oh yeah, okay, sorry, we don't have 200 different kinds of toothpaste. But I actually think that was a pretty serious problem as experienced by people who lived in those societies.
Right.
And they certainly experienced it as such.
It's like, I don't need 10 types of toothpaste, but I would like more than garbanzo beans. If that's at all possible, that would be great. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that, I think that you can, square the circle here. I think you could say, look, I mean, absolutely, FMF on the core point, right? That like we don't need capitalism for any of this stuff. That like there are in fact lots of things that the public sector can do. That you can there are other examples besides the Soviet Union, right? You can look around the world at even what's happened under capitalism, under advanced social democracies, where different sectors of the economy have been taken under public ownership, and we've shown that there's good results. That you don't actually need private sector, competition to.
Well, I find a lot of people that argue against the larger concept of socialism believe that socialism or any of the tendencies of it are reflect an absence of markets, which is not the case. It's you can build out a market-based system, but have socialist tendencies in your not only your political expressions, but through your economic expressions. But that idea that markets are somehow the intellectual property of capitalism exclusively, I think, is one of the things that people, that at least even my idea going into it and doing research over the last few years is like, I just figured that was the purview of the capitalist structure, but it's not. I mean, a market-based system is more fundamental to that, and it's how we move goods and people and services throughout the world.
Yeah, I mean, look, their capitalism is something that's existed for a few hundred years. Markets have existed in one form or another for thousands and thousands of years. So the existence of markets is certainly a necessary condition for the existence of capitalism, but it's not a sufficient one. And I do think that there's a case that you can make that, like, if you can kind of, if you can figure out these logistical problems that we've been talking about the things that centralized planning is currently not good at, right? Then yeah, I mean, look, maybe a completely marketless form of socialism would be, would be like the most egalitarian and, desirable outcome. I'm totally open to that. Right. But I also, because I'm interested in convincing people that socialism is possible, I don't want to just help myself to the assumption that, we're going to get to technological singularity first. And so, supercomputers will deliver us, fully automated luxury communism. We just don't need to worry about it. Or, that there's going to be some, great spiritual shift in human nature or any of that stuff, right? That they have, I think if you're just not helping yourself to any of those assumptions, you're sort of being like maximally realistic about what's currently technologically or psychologically possible. Okay, look, we know that we don't need markets to have a good healthcare system. We know that we don't need markets to have a good education system, et cetera. These are all places where I think totally marketless economic planning makes perfect sense right now. And, it is not, I mean, like whatever you could find, plenty of places where, where those things are, having good effects right now. Then, when, and I do have the traditional socialist view that it's very important that at least the commanding heights of the economy be under the control of the big collective, right? All of us, that, because that's the stuff that, has the most effect on everybody who lives in a society. So, so that does mean, for example, right, that not just the, the sort of things that make sense to provide as decommodified public services that I just laid out, but also, energy resources, for example, transportation. I would add broadband now. And crucially, going back to what you were saying earlier about Proudhon, banking, because then I think, look, if we do,
and I think I alluded to his concept as closer to central banking when it's really, it would be more akin to what we would consider credit unions today. So I think I sort of mischaracterized that a little bit. But the point being that access to a more egalitarian access to capital that could be spread among and then staying within the communities was closer to his idea, I think.
Totally, yeah. So I mean, I think there is a core insight there in Proudhon. I just think that, I think you do need the state, right? Again, the sort of biggest we needs to, like the thing that has the most control over the overall flow of resources in our society has to be under the control of that. And then, if you do still need a market sector for the sake of the things that you need fingers for, then I would say there's no reason it can't at least be a market sector of worker-owned firms. So you can get, like, people can read, I already mentioned the first chapter of Bhaskar's book, or for like slightly kind of wonkier technical deep dive on this, Mike Beggs has an article from Catalyst called Markets and Workplace Under Democratic Socialism. It was reprinted in Jacobin. I do not remember what it was called. What was reprinted in Jacobin? Yeah, Beggs, Beggs. Or for a somewhat similar idea, there's a book. There was a book from like the early 2000s by maybe like 2001 or 2 or something by David Schweikart called After Capitalism, that I think is also, like very similar idea, right? That you could have essentially, right, to get around these structural problems that there are, it's a lot easier, under the rules of markets as they're currently structured, it's a lot easier to have a worker cooperative coffee shop than like a worker cooperative foundry, right? That's that like actual like physical capital is in some sectors of the economy incredibly expensive, and And if
And nowadays, in all sectors of the economy, truly, I mean,
yeah,
I think the barrier to entry right now is significant. And
totally.
we came out of this zero interest rate environment when you and I. It's so funny because the coming out of the zero interest rate environment showed a few things. Number one is it made it harder for startup
Yeah,
capital, entrepreneurial capital, to actually to work its way through for that coffee shop or somebody that has
yeah,
the small local retail idea. But it also exposed a lot of the private equity market and a lot of the bigger capitalist enterprises that were riding high on this low to no interest rate environment, or the banking institutions that were essentially engaging in legal arbitrage, in having rates that were pinned below what they could get back from treasuries. And so it sort of gave this idea that that the capitalist class was that they were just on this ultimate winning streak. They couldn't lose. They were
yeah.
untouchable. They were omniscient. And then now they've kind of been exposed for how difficult this environment is. And it's sort of so I see this as this should be one of those moments in a high interest rate and high inflationary environment. This should be one of those moments where it exposes the capitalist structure to such a degree that a lot of the underclasses begin to say, "Wait a minute, you weren't right about this, or my job isn't as secure, and I don't like living these slave wages because household debt is now at the highest point it's ever been in history. Period. End of story." And people are feeling that squeeze, which I think is what we're seeing reflected, obviously, in the polling data. A lot of it might be, yes, I feel terrible about Gaza. Yes, I feel terrible about this event or something that's happening on the ground. But I think what people are really feeling is squeezed, that economic pressure that comes from these moments where all of the wrong things accelerate through the economy and expose just how fragile we all are. And I didn't mean to take you off.
Sure. Yeah,
I wanted to actually build on something
yeah,
that you had said before when we were talking about innovation and coming out of certain cycles, and but also the idea of what could work here. So again, bridging the gap of, we know what the structural impediments are to us building out systems like Mondragon here that would be wildly successful and super competitive with the capitalistic structure. I've read a lot of Schumpeter, who's
yeah.
dense, but I think artful in the way he explains a lot of things. And one of the things that stuck with me was he was talking about. I think there's a reading of Schumpeter that actually demonstrates that he is more aligned with Marx in that he believed that socialism was the logical extension. I think he was just coming about it in a more modern way. But one of the things that he was suggesting at the time was, Americans, for example, would like to think that we could live under some sort of Swedish style social democracy. But in order to actually effectuate that, you would have to import Swedes into the United States and have them run everything, because we are so culturally obstinate, because we have this sort of idea that we're still in this frontier mindset, this rugged individualist mindset. No matter how much we actually just want wages and a fair shake at things, we still believe ourselves to sort of be wrapped up in this frontier mindset. And so he said that culturally it would be impossible to adopt any sort of model that you would see outside the United States working here, because we're just different. Our economy is different. We're hardwired differently. There are cultural aspects to our identity that do not lend themselves to that sort of collectivist ideal. And so we're going to have to think about something new. And honestly, Ben, that really resonated with me, because I think when you just have normal conversations with people in the street, they don't get hung up in definitions or in the history of things. They want to be left the fuck alone. They want to be able to, pay their bills, do great stuff on the weekends, not be bothered or burdened by too many bureaucratic items, and that they do sort of have this cultural sense that we are, for lack of a better term, we're exceptional. We're Americans. So when you conceive of these things in the future, when you set it against the cultural landscape in the United States, what areas of the economy in particular do you think would be palatable to the wider American public in a way that we could kind of coalesce around these ideas?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that the Bernie movement was correct in thinking that healthcare is something that that's a good that's a good is a very ripe target, right? That
Mm-hmm.
it takes up a bunch of the economy, so it's like that would be like extremely significant if it happened, and that's I mean part of the reason why it's so hard to make it happen, right? There'd definitely be a lot of resistance from capital, but also I think if you're whatever sort of cultural story you want to tell about America that you think makes people especially resistant to socialism, the one thing I'll say about that is that I'll note that Americans aren't too culturally hardwired to accept Medicare when they turn 65, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's
Yeah. Or open up their mailbox and get the mail, or
yeah,
there's a thousand
exactly, right.
examples. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, my God, I mean, the mailbox. This is, consistently, you do polls of sort of how people feel about different branches of the government, and the postal service is like the most popular, more than the military, more than anything, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, what I would think from that is that, look, I mean, it seems to me that, I don't, I'm not going to go so far as to deny that there's a, bigger libertarian streak in American culture that, as it currently exists, than there is in many other cultures. We could argue about the causality, right? But
Mm.
I'm not going to deny that that's true. But, I would also note that when people can see that these things are improving their lives, they tend to want to keep them, right? That they and like sometimes even very sometimes even no matter how confused they are about it, right? Like that notorious sign from like the anti-Obama town hall early Tea Party stuff where the woman had the sign about keep your government hands off my Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
That's it's
Yeah.
like people like people can like you even said earlier, right? There is a widespread desire for certain kinds of economic security, and that and and I think again, when people can see that things improve their lives in practice, it's it's easier to they are in fact going to support them, right? Whatever kind of libertarian streak exists in American culture, and again, whatever the causality is for it, like it's not enough that that people aren't going to like the idea of getting healthcare. Like I think the most in fact right now, right, the idea of Medicare for all polls well. I mean, I don't think most people are like optimistic that it's going to happen. So I don't think they're like mad that it's not happening, because I don't think they ever thought it was going to. But like, if you just ask them as an abstract proposition, would you like this?
Right.
They'll say yes, right? And I think similarly, there's even there's a book I remember called it's like the myth or the myths of Mondragon, that's somebody who's like I mean, they're like a leftist, the author, but they're like somewhat critical of certain things about it, and how it's perceived and everything. But there's also, to my mind, right, the most telling part of the book is there's a conversation with some Mondragon workers, like going through their various complaints, and they're like, oh, so would you consider like quitting and getting a job at a private company? Like, oh, hell no. Why would I do that? Right. That's
Right.
like, I'm not going to give up on my share and my vote. Right. That's,
Right. By the way, it was killing me. In the debate with Friedman, how he kept calling it Mondragon. And I'm like, this is so purposeful. God, stop it.
yeah, I wouldn't, I don't even know if it was on purpose or not, but yeah, that's like, but it's like, look, I think people who, like once, like even with just regular unions, right? I mean, something that, that just doesn't happen is that, a workplace is unionized and you get a contract, and then 2 years later, without the employer having to do anything, there's just like a vote to decertify because people decide they'd prefer more flexible working conditions or whatever, right? Like that's like just not a thing that happens, right? That you know,
Right.
once you give people a taste of having a little bit of power on the job and a little bit of extra security that comes out of that, right? They like it. They want more of it, right? So it's like, yeah, I'm under no illusions that, you know, a majority of Americans are you know, ready to, you know, sign up with all the insane commie shit I just said a few minutes ago. But
you know what's so frustrating to me, man?
I do think a majority of Americans would be on board with a social contract that was somewhat more tilted towards the interests of working people than we have right now, and that did involve more, you know, like it did involve at least a few more social services, you know, more protections for labor, etc. And I think, you know, once that's been achieved, right, you know, I think that successes can build on each other, and I don't want to be rosy about this. I think it's a incredibly long road full of, you know, places that you could fall off the cliff, right? But I do think a certain road opens up once you know, once you've got some points on the board.
I just wonder though, what I guess maybe I'm not confused by it, but I'm frustrated by it is why we don't have greater antipathy toward corporations in general. Like I have a weird relationship with music because my parents growing up subjected me to country music. So we're talking about, you know, like 1970s country music. But this is the era of Norma Ray, and this is the era of take this job and shove it. And this is a time I think that is sort of the last vestiges of rural America giving the finger, not just to coastal elitists, but to the man. Fuck the man, fuck the corporation. You know, this is my job and I want to fight for those rights. And we lost that somewhere along the way, presumably in the Reagan 80s and then with the height of the neoliberalism movement. But I think it still frustrates me that we haven't been able to take at least that narrative back and shift the animus that we feel toward, okay, if you don't want to put it at the corporate at the two-party duopoly, at least let's get back on the same page that the corporations are the bad guys, right? And we have trouble getting there, and that's frustrating to me.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. I mean, I don't know. I also think that the probably in the specific case of country music, I think that there's probably some economic facts about the way that distribution has changed, since the 70s that probably lend themselves towards more homogenized products than the sort of stuff that was coming out in the outlaw era. But yeah, although on the other, I don't know. I mean, look, what I was thinking about as you were saying that was, the much discussed late last year viral hit Rich Men North of Richmond, which has some very right-wing lyrics in it, right? But
there's an opening.
But also, right? Like
there's an opening.
Yeah, there's some stuff in there about. I mean, look, the title is about rich men. The early lyrics are about working overtime hours for bullshit pay. Like there's definitely like I mean, I think that guy's just kind of confused and a little all over the place, right? But like but like I think that both the author and anybody nodding along, when they hear those lyrics, right? I mean, there's stuff. Sure.
And they're still going outside and they're mowing down Bud Light cans with an AK-47. I know we have some other.
Sure. But, which, I mean, whatever, right? That's fine.
Yeah.
Like I'm not, I don't, just, practice gun safety and I have no objection to any of that. But like I have but I don't, but like that person, like I do think that there is some stuff that you could work with there, right? Like that that there is, there is some of that antipathy, being directed at the corporate overlords there, even if it's in a confused way that's like mixed up with stuff that we don't like, right? That's I think that you're probably I'd also note that like the 70s, I mean that's at a time when when you had, I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's the era where like wildcat strikes are happening constantly, that even though it's sort of the beginning of the great neoliberal turn, it's also, it's also an area where, there was a lot, there was much stronger organized labor. And so there's stuff there that like would help channel some of that discontent in in a little bit better direction, even just kind of naturally, right? That people can see that, right? So it's like, yeah, I mean, I think it, I mean, it's frustrating, right? But like, I don't, I think there are some glimmers of light there.
We're coming up on time here, and I want to respect your time to make sure I let you go. I have about 1,000 other things I want to talk to you about, from authoritarianism and against leftists in Latin America, to actually trying to project and take the conflict in Gaza to its logical conclusion, and kind of what that portends for the Palestinian conflict and the wider conflict in that region. So I'm curious, would you be willing to put a pin in it and come back in short order and talk to us?
Yeah, very happy to do that. Yeah, I do have to skedaddle in a few minutes to go teach, but yeah, very happy to come back.
All right, so let me just ask you one final question. What music are you listening to lately? What's the sound? What's your writing soundtrack? What gets Ben Burgis motivated to crank out the columns?
Yeah, let's see. Lately, yeah, I mean, nothing too interesting. I think lately, I mean, like, I listen to a fair amount of classic rock, which I guess probably doesn't surprise anybody. And I've seen a lot of people joking about, how often I'll wear the Rolling Stones, tongue and lick, t-shirt. So there's a fair amount of that. There's some, there's some stuff, I don't know, like I have, I guess the most directly political thing, I think I can remember, listed to lately was, Sturgill Simpson, but that's, it's like a lot of times, like I'll just request things on Spotify, then just listen to whatever it plays me after that,
okay.
Honestly.
All right, I'll ask the algorithm. What's going on in Burgess land?
I mean, ideally, if I'm doing, I mean, like, I don't know, sometimes I'll like, I guess I'm approaching the age where it's like, there's a fair amount of stuff that I'll like listen to now, because it like makes me nostalgic for listening to it 20 years ago,
Oh, so, absolutely. Yeah. My whole playlist is just comfort food at this point, without a doubt.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you a Jersey boy? Are you a Jersey native?
No. I'm not a Jersey native. I lived in New Jersey for a few years in the late 2010s. But no, I actually grew up in Michigan.
A Michigan boy. Okay. All right. All right. That makes sense, because I like you so much. And it's actually illegal for guys from New York and New Jersey to get along, famously. So that all tracks with me right now. I just want to thank you, not just for the time today, but for the extraordinary work that you do and the prolific amount of work that you do and you put out there. So just to remind everybody, and Ben, if you can hang with me for
Sure.
just a minute or two afterwards, but just to remind everybody, give them an argument, subscribe to it on your podcast feeds, definitely follow it on YouTube if you're not already, although I'm sure that most of you are. And dig into the back catalog. You have a book on Christopher Hitchens. You have how many books have you written now? 3 or 4, is it?
4, although that's counting one from an academic press that a lot fewer people read than the ones you're talking about. But yeah, okay. But yeah, the big one was also called "Give Them an Argument." There is "Canceling Comedians While the World Burns," and which is extended expression of frustration with my friends and comrades, and there's the Hitchens one, and then there's like a academic book called Logic Without Gaps or Gluts from Springer. But there is coming, God, I hope 2025. We'll see when it actually gets done. I am writing a book with Bhaskar Sankara and Mike Begg, who I mentioned earlier, about basically what a sort of realistic vision of a socialist economy would look like. So that's going to be from Verso Books, called The Blueprint.
That's amazing. That's awesome, and something to look forward to. All right, so make sure you're reading Ben and the Jacobin. Make sure you're following him on everything from podcasts to watching him on YouTube. And Ben, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, and I'm excited to have you back sometime soon.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much.